Let me say thank you to you all for coming. This book has been about 10 years in the making. Much of that, or some of that, figuring out how to even write such a book and get it published, but also the effort to gather documents from mildewed archives and find old obsolete videotapes, police records, court records, and most importantly, interviews with many of the people who could tell me their experience of what had happened, crucially during the years of 2004 to 2008, but going back to the 1990s and into the present. The point of all this being, I'm really delighted to be able to celebrate its launch with all of you here and everyone online as well, and I'm especially thrilled to have Suciwati here joining us by Zoom. The book is about Munir, who was a singular activist, the likes of which Indonesia had not seen before and may not see again. He was born in 1965, the year that General Suharto took power, or began his seizure of power in what was one of the bloodiest massacres of the 20th century over many months. Munir then emerged as a key figure in the 1990s. He was born and raised under that regime, and by the 1990s he came to prominence, particularly challenging President Suharto and his military allies on the killings, disappearances, and other human rights violations that had started to increase as President Suharto tried to cling to power. Munir became even more important in the period after Suharto's fall, in a period of reform known as Reformasi, where Munir was everywhere you turned in terms of working on legal reform, military reform, creating new courts and new structures to protect the human rights of Indonesians and to seek accountability for the past. In short, he was a model of courage in a place that had known a lot of fear. He was a model of pluralism in a country that was moving towards greater intolerance, and he was precisely what Indonesia needed at that time. And at that moment, Indonesia lost him. In 2004, Munir decided to study abroad in the Netherlands, and he boarded a plane in Jakarta and died before the plane landed in Amsterdam. The book is the story of Munir as a man and an activist, about his death, and primarily it is about the search for truth and justice by Munir's family and his friends and the human rights community more broadly. I'd like to start with a short reading, read a short section from the book that takes place in 2008, 4 years after Munir died. It is a courtroom scene, and I chose it because there's some inherent drama to it, but also it reveals something of the atmosphere in the courtrooms of these pivotal trials. It tells something about the character of Suciwati and her courage, and also the character of the defendant in this case, General Mukti, who had been a two-star general in 1998 at the time of Suharto's fall, and had lost his position, lost his command in the army, in part due to Munir's activism, at which point he moved to the intelligence service and has been accused at this stage of, in the story, of masterminding the plot to kill Munir. I'll read a short section from that part of the book. On September 9th, 2008, the judges would rule whether to proceed to the evidence phase. Mukti's supporters included hired muscle from a group calling itself the Red and White Brigade, and the women's branch of the martial arts group Sacred Footsteps of the Sons of Muhammadiyah. The group was one of Mukti's sources of unofficial power, giving him a link to the influential Muslim organization Muhammadiyah and foot soldiers to mobilize when needed. They were among his most reliable supporters, arriving as much as 2 hours before each session began to take up positions by the courtroom doors. Once the doors opened, the room filled quickly and chaotically. Their advanced position allowed the martial arts group to claim the front rows, and from there they could clap for Mukti and his lawyers or jeer loudly if the prosecutors or a witness stumbled. Munir's supporters had to stand in the back and in the aisles. We'll skip the substantive part of this hearing, at the end of which the judges decide that the trial should proceed to the evidence phase. The hearing over, the defense made a show of great confidence. Mukti rose from his chair with a broad smile. One lawyer embraced him before the rest shook hands with him over the table. Still grinning, Mukti turned to shake hands with the supporters pressing forward to greet him. Mukti's smile faded and his face tensed. There, among the crush of well-wishers, Suci was waiting for him. "Just admit it already," she said. "Just admit it. Then you'll be able to fast." It was the fasting month of Ramadan, a time for Muslims to behave morally, reflect, and improve themselves spiritually. Mukti ignored her, shaking the next hand thrust at him. Then he turned back towards Suci and paused. His face darkened with anger as he spoke with startling vehemence. "Shut up, you!" He used the familiar form of you, "Diam kamu," as if speaking to a servant or a child. He shook a few more hands, waved, and recovered his smile before exiting the courtroom under police guard. Mukti's lawyer later complained that Suci had violated his client's right to be considered innocent. He assured the press that Mukti would not sue her, however, content to let her punishment come in the afterlife. For her part, Suci explained she'd only wanted to remind him it was Ramadan, but she added, "Let people know what Mukti really looks like. This shows who he is." She would have a chance to say more as the first witness.
So I want to begin actually by asking you, Suciwati, to talk a little bit more about Munir and who he was for Indonesia and who he was as a person. I don't know if I should look this way, but I'm looking at you in Indonesia. And welcome to the conversation.
Kenapa?
You're good. I think you guys are muted.
Munir tentu saja buat saya sih dia sangat berani. Perannya memecahkan ketakutan masyarakat sipil yang waktu itu sangat mencekam, ketakutan yang sangat mencekam di Indonesia dalam pemerintahan Soeharto. Dan dia juga mengajarkan memperjuangkan hak asasi manusia dan demokrasi.
Munir was very brave. He shattered the fear that held Indonesia by the military regime, and Munir also advocated human rights and fight for human rights and the democracy in Indonesia.
And why, and this is obviously a key part of the book, but I think hearing your thoughts, Suciwati, is important. Would people, very basically, why would people want to kill him, given the role that he played?
Buat saya sih ada hal yang penting di sana, salah satunya adalah membuat para pejuang HAM menjadi ketakutan. Yang kedua, kenapa pembunuhan itu dilakukan di putaran kedua pilihan presiden, kemudian di persidangan kita bisa tahu di sana.
Most of the factor is they're giving fear to the people who are for human rights or the human rights defender, and the other factor was the murder happened on the second round of presidential election, which was linked to the BIN or the secret agents of Indonesia, and the people who were governing was the team campaign of the president. And in the court, the evidence was being denied or rejected.
Di pengadilan itu akhirnya ditemukan ada link ke Badan Intelijen Negara, sehingga kita melihat ada alasan yang jelas apakah ini terkait dengan politik. Nah, itu yang sampai sekarang belum dijawab karena dalangnya tidak pernah ditangkap.
The court found in the court we found that there's a link between the
Badan Intelijen
Secret Service?
the secret agents of Indonesia, and we linked that. Apparently, we have linked that into the politics. Therefore,
di pengadilan ternyata diingkari dan di pengadilan itu dibuktikan bahwa ada BIN itu keterkaitan BIN, tapi dalangnya tidak ditangkap sampai sekarang.
okay, the real perpetrator didn't get arrested until now.
Dijelaskan.
In the court, in the court that we found some evidence which got linked into the BIN or Indonesian secret agent, and the murder was linked to politics, to their politics. Yes.
And the real perpetrator didn't.
And the real perpetrator, as of today, hasn't been arrested yet.
Right.
Karena di pengadilan dia dibebaskan.
Yeah, again, it was menjawabkan.
So Matt, Munir was only 38 years old, but he was a household name in Indonesia at the time, and murdering somebody who was a household name like that was, as you conveyed clearly, an extraordinary move. And so what would sort of make people think that they could get away with that, or that the blowback, the response, would, frankly, in a kind of amoral sense, be worth it, right? What would make people want to do that?
Well, the simplest answer is they thought that because, or they killed such a prominent man in such a public way because they felt confident they could get away with it. And the more comprehensive answer is, if we assume that there was a range of motives, including the two that Suciwati mentioned, to instill fear that there was a political motive linked to the presidential elections that were to be held the following week, there's a possible revenge motive, or to silence.
A revenge because he had pushed for accountability against some generals who
had in fact lost their military commands over it.
Right, over
feared,
massacres that he had insisted
correct.
be investigated.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And that there was, for the most part, most had not been, had yet to be prosecuted and maintained positions of power and influence, whether at the state intelligence agency BIN or in government, in the military. But that as rational actors, they may have done a kind of cost-benefit analysis and figured that the risks they faced by killing him were less than the benefits they would gain from it. And one of the tragedies, I believe, of the whole story, among the many, is a few years earlier they might have come to a different conclusion, because there were generals being prosecuted for crimes against humanity in what had been known as East Timor. There were new human rights courts being set up, often due to the work of Munir and people like him, and they may have felt that the blowback would have been too intense. And a few years later, they may also, for different reasons, have decided that it wasn't worth it, because they would have seen the failure of reform such that they didn't have to fear losing their freedom or their positions of power and influence, and may have decided that there was no need to kill Munir because they felt secure.
So it's a sort of interregnum period. You referred to it at the beginning of this, reformasi, where Indonesia had been an authoritarian regime for 20-something years.
30 years, yeah.
Right. Suharto loses power, and there's almost a kind of sense of a Prague Spring, but it's unclear how much of that's really going to follow through, and this is a kind of pushback.
Yes.
against it.
Yeah.
In some sense. So I want to just get it generally your own. You talked about this being a 10-year project, writing the book. You have to have a lot of motivation to work on something for 10 years. So can you talk about that? What drove you? Not what drove you crazy,
yes.
but what drove you to be so committed to doing the book, and why you think it's important for people in the United States to understand the story.
Well, September 7th, 2004 was my first day at a new job at a human rights organization in New York, and my focus was to be on the protection of human rights activists, particularly in Southeast Asia. I'd already worked on Indonesia for some time at that point, on and off, and I was planning on going the following week for the presidential elections that Suciwati had mentioned. And that day, my first day on the job, was the day that Munir died. I was shocked to learn that he died, and shocked even more to learn a few months later that an autopsy had found a massive dose of arsenic in his system. And it became a key component of my work on Indonesia. And through that work, I got to know Suciwati, and I got to know some of Munir's other colleagues, some of whom I had known from before, and some of whom I met. And I worked with them I went to some of the trials. I coordinated with them on advocacy in Jakarta and Geneva and Washington, D.C., and came to follow the case as closely as I could, its ups and downs. And after I left that job, I began to think that it was important that more people knew this story. I wanted them to know the story of Munir as a singular figure and a model for human rights activists and other kinds of activists around the world. And I also wanted people to know more about the Indonesia that I knew in all its complexities. It's often observed that there's a strange sort of blank spot about Indonesia in the United States and the West more generally, that despite being the fourth largest country by population, it's got 12,000 islands, one of which is Java, has a larger population than Japan or Russia. It has many islands that people are aware of but aren't sure where they are. Borneo, Bali, Java, Sumatra, the Spice Islands or the Moluccas, and has an incredibly rich and diverse history, religion, arts, dance, and politics. And I wanted to share that, and I felt that one way of doing that was to tell the story of Munir in a way that was not. In fact, these two stories are the same. That the story of Munir is the story of modern Indonesia. This courage and creativity, the persistence of the past, all of it is there. And then my final hope in doing this was that if I could tell that story well, I could get at something more universal, show what impunity looks and feels like, and get at some of the tensions of fear and courage, memory and forgetting, truth and power. And that if I could tell that story well, all of these would come out in a way that people could understand and relate to.
So I want to follow up on that, because you talk about the importance of truth and memory and forgetting, and reading the book, there's there are these strands of demagogues and fake news and the fog of fake news, and I don't know about you all, that all feels very foreign to me. I've never heard of that in the United States. But in reading it, to me, on the one hand, yes, it's about a country that's very far away and that has a very different culture and has a very different history, and yet, particularly when it comes to democracy, that in some ways is kind of moving in a different direction. It's a country that had 30 years, as we were talking about, of a authoritarian regime, and was moving toward democracy, and there has been a pushback. In the United States, there's a different history, obviously, but there's also obviously a pushback. And I wonder if you can talk about, I mean, again, I saw the similarities as a reader, but can you talk about the similarities or dissimilarities that you see that obviously exist?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I first started working on the book and I was working on a proposal and trying to find interest for it, I was often encouraged, like, oh, can you find more parallels to the U.S.? And I resisted that. I thought, I'd lived, if only temporarily, under Suharto in Indonesia and President Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and I thought, the U.S. is a different animal. We have strong institutions and protections and bulwarks against that kind of authoritarianism. And then as each year of the Trump administration passed, I became less and less resistant to that comparison, and began to see how some of these same things, while Indonesia and the US are two very different countries, there certainly are similarities and lessons to learn from Indonesia and from those who have resisted authoritarianism there. But two of the ones that stand out most from my work on the story is for one, the court system in Indonesia was notoriously weak and corrupt under Suharto. Now 25 years has gone by since his fall, and they remain weak and corrupt. And one lesson from that is if you weaken the institutions and trusted institutions, it's very hard to come back from that. And secondly, one of the key focuses of Munir's work was trying to change a political culture of violence that he had seen under Suharto, and that even after that government ended, elements of that continued, the use of paramilitaries, the use of violence and threats, and to see some elements of that in our own society, it seemed in some ways sadly familiar to see what were effectively paramilitary violence on January 6th, to see other elements of that. And one of the lessons from Indonesia is the need for accountability when this happens, that truth is important, and much of the book is a search for the truth, and the January 6th Commission is seeking the truth, but truth itself is not enough, not only because victims themselves demand and require justice, but because without accountability, violence replicates itself and can expand even further. And related to that is what you mentioned about one reason the truth is often not enough is because the truth is easily contested, even if we think that we have reached the truth. And we saw that in the Munir case, as inside and outside the courtroom, the defenders of those who were accused of the crime said, maybe Munir died a natural death, maybe his own colleagues killed him, maybe this is all the result of foreign intervention and not anything based on the truth. And they were able to stir up confusion in a way that seems quite familiar in the US. And that is why there's a need for accountability in addition.
So, Suciwati, I also want to ask you about lessons. I mean, you have pushed for accountability now for nearly 20 years in this case. And in the book, Matt quotes you talking about how you have kept a flicker of hope and how important that flicker of hope has been. And I wonder if in there also lies lessons for us, all of us as citizens who are engaged, hopefully, with our country and with the world, and in terms of maintaining hope. So I mean this to be a positive thing, which is to say, how do you maintain hope through this?
Ada harapan itu lebih karena saya sebagai korban, dan tentu saja saya bersama dengan beberapa teman-teman korban yang lain, karena perjuangan ini berbasis karena rasa mencintai, dan jangan sampai ada orang lain yang merasakan hal yang menyakitkan ini. Kamu terjemahkan dulu?
Okay. Of course, I was with other victims' friend because the struggle was like based on love and don't want to let anyone else feel this painful thing. So,
Dan strategi yang saya bangun bersama kawan-kawan membuat aksi diam Kamisan di depan istana dan terus menyuarakan untuk melawan lupa karena selama ini pemerintah ini selalu mengingkari bahwa ada korban atas kejahatan hak asasi manusia itu. Mungkin kamu jelaskan.
okay. We were strategizing together with friend to hold a Thursday action in front of the palace, standing there in silence, and continue to speak out against forgetting, because so far these governments have always denied that they are victims of these human rights crimes.
Dan strategi yang selanjutnya tentu saja ini akan melelahkan, tapi buat saya tidak boleh menyerah. Dan salah satu strategi lainnya saya membuat museum HAM Munir yang berbasis pendidikan HAM. Salah satu saya menjaga harapan karena ini buat anak cucu saya ke depan dan kawan-kawan saya yang lain.
Yeah. The next strategy, of course, will be tiring for me, but I could not give up. And one other strategy was creating a museum, human rights museum with Munir's name on it, based on human rights education. Of course, it'll be tiring, but for maintaining the hope itself, it's for the better future of my friends, my children, and my family, and for the better future of Indonesia.
Great. Should we move to questions? Are there any other, Suciwati, are there any other thoughts that you want to convey, I should ask?
Buat saya mungkin juga soal bagaimana hari ini yang diperjuangkan Munir adalah selalu bersama korban kasus pelanggaran HAM dan semua orang-orang yang tertindas itu Munir ada di sana. Dan buat saya hal yang paling mungkin saya lakukan adalah dengan terus menjaga harapan korban, dengan terus bersuara bersama-sama untuk melawan lupa. Fight untuk tentu saja untuk keadilan, tapi kita selalu membuat strategi terus-menerus terhadap kasusnya.
We want to add on the fact that Munir is always with the victims of human rights violations and all the people who are oppressed. Munir is also there. And for me, the most I can do is continue to maintain the hopes of the victims by continuing to speak together to fight forgetfulness.
Dan harapan saya tentu saja buat teman-teman audiens dan teman-teman yang mendengarkan semuanya ini penting untuk terus memberikan saya support atau dukungan dengan mempertanyakan, karena hari ini dalang pembunuh Munir belum ditangkap dan hari ini lewat ombudsman ini dianggap tidak maladministrasi ketika sebuah dokumen negara dihilangkan. Ini buat saya penting pertanyaan yang terus dilontarkan oleh kawan-kawan semua di Amerika ataupun di semua yang ikut tergabung di seluruh dunia. Saya pikir ini penting untuk mengingatkan ada hal yang janggal dan terus-menerus dipelihara oleh negara Indonesia dan itu salah kalau dibiarkan.
We hope that for the audience to support by questioning Indonesia, because until today, Munir's killer has not been arrested, and today through the ombudsman, it is not considered to be maladministration to lost
menghilangkan
the evidence
dokumen
to
TPF.
the document of TPF. And I think it is important that there are things that are odd and being maintained by Indonesia.
Meminta dukungan kepada teman-teman tadi. Udah. Oh, oke. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions from the audience? I don't know how the right way to do this. Oh, there's a microphone that's coming.
Yeah, so if you have a question, you can raise your hand and Campbell will come over to you with a microphone.
How has that, the culture of fear in Indonesia changed after his death?
I will say that in the short term, I assume this is a question for me, but we can turn it over to Suciwati as well. But among the human rights community, there was a significant, I would say, a spike in fear after Munir's death, that if someone of his stature could be killed, then no one was safe. I will say generally, many things have improved in Indonesia. I don't want to paint a picture of a bleak continuity between the old regime and the current one. There's much more freedom of speech. There has been, some meaningful military reform that can't be denied, and things are not as they were. However, for those, there are certain conflict areas. Papua is one of them, or areas with that are seen to be having some viewed as having separatist impulses, where there are extremely harsh crackdowns. And the human rights defender community, people who are advocating on behalf of minorities and the environment and others, continue to be targeted, sometimes with violence, physical attacks, up to and including killings. And I have to believe this is very much follows from the failure to hold people responsible in the killing of Munir.
Suciwati, you want to add anything?
Setelah meninggalnya Munir, ancaman terhadap human rights defender hari ini semakin terbuka, dan kita bisa melihat ada Salim Kancil, yang ada beberapa orang lah ya yang cukup terkenal. Bahkan hari ini kita bisa melihat Haris Azhar dan Fathia, koordinator kontras, itu juga digugat oleh salah satu pejabat negara, dan itu menunjukkan ancamannya semakin tinggi, apalagi ada undang-undang Omnibus Law, kemudian ada Cipta Kerja ya, kemudian juga ada undang-undang ITE, bagaimana orang kalau mengkritik pemerintah dengan mudah akan dibawa ke pengadilan lewat elektronik, media sosial dan sebagainya. Dan sekarang semakin terang-terangan kalau saya melihat ini ya, bahwa menuju ke secara pelan dan pasti akan menuju kembali ke ruang otoritarian lagi kan, dengan model yang baru ya. Saya pikir ada lagi RUU KUHP akan lebih menyeramkan lagi kalau itu memang betul-betul akan disahkan. Jadi memang sebuah ruang yang semakin menunjukkan demokrasi semakin menurun di Indonesia.
After Munir's death, the threats to the numbers of defenders are becoming more and more open today, and we can see there are
Salim
Kancil, and there are some there are people who are like Haris Azhar and Fathia, the contrast coordinators, were also sued by one of the state officials, and it shows the threat is getting higher, especially when there is law that Omnibus Law, and there are law of ITE,
which technology internet and technology law.
Yeah, so people who criticize the government will easily be brought to court via electronic social media and so on. And now it's getting clearer when I see that it is slowly and surely going back to the authoritarian um, space again with the new model. Yes, I think there's another criminal code bill that will be even more frightening if it really will be ratified. So it is indeed a space that shows democracy is declining in Indonesia.
Very impressive translation. This was- there was another question, I think.
Let's see if I can remember now. Matt, I'm wondering, well, I had several questions. Let's see. What can we do? Actually, it's for both of you. What can we do in the United States to help the situation there? I actually have two questions. That's my first question. My second question is, I'm very impressed that she's working on building a museum, if I understand correctly. And in that environment there, what kind of obstacles are you facing? Because it seems like it's still a struggle to not have the democratic norms happening. That's it.
Okay. I'll try to answer the first part, and then turn it over to Suciwati and her able translators. I mean, in my previous work in human rights organizations, there was always a clear ask and something to do. And I wrote this book in a somewhat different mode as a narrative, but that doesn't necessitate not taking action. And so the first thing is to pay attention to Indonesia. It's not infrequently that we've had some contact between our own government and the Indonesian government through the regional organization and security frameworks and things like that. And it's quite possible to let your own, and I encourage to let your own representatives and U.S. government know that human rights in Indonesia are something you care about. These particular cases, which I can provide more information about, tend to be in the form of lawsuits and defamation cases that may try to infringe on the freedom of speech of human rights activists, and the Munir case in particular, to continue to let our own representatives know and to let the Indonesian government know that this is something that is important to you. In the words of the activists who work on this case, to refuse to forget. And I'll let Suciwati answer that question about what Americans can do, but also the question of how is it in the current climate to create a human rights museum.
Mungkin dengan tadi yang saya bilang tetap menanyakan, mengirim surat, dengan cara mengirim surat atau bisa langsung juga lewat Twitter bertanya langsung ke Presiden Joko Widodo barangkali bagaimana kasus Munir hari ini, karena sampai sekarang harusnya negara tetap bertanggung jawab kalau dokumen TPF yang harusnya itu diumumkan tapi dinyatakan hilang, karena dokumen itulah yang bisa membawa siapa dalang sesungguhnya yang membunuh Munir. Jadi teman-teman bisa terus menulis mention, tag dan sebagainya kepada presiden atau pemerintah Indonesia yang lain, mungkin menteri luar negeri. Itu sih. Karena resmi atau tidak.
We could start by questioning or sending a letter, or you can ask directly via Twitter and ask directly to President Joko Widodo by tagging him. How about questioning about how about Munir's case today, because it until now the the people who should be responsible of the TPF document is not doing their job, which should be announced but was declared lost, because that document can lead to can show us who actually killed Munir. So the audience can continue to write and so on to the president and another Indonesian government, maybe the foreign minister.
And what about the museum? How has it been creating a human rights museum in the current climate in Indonesia?
Hari ini Museum Munir sebetulnya kita sudah diberikan ruang oleh pemerintah Kota Batu untuk membangun dengan diberikan tanah sebesar 2.000 meter lebih, dan kemudian oleh pihak pemerintah provinsi juga diberikan dana. Dan hari ini sudah selesai harusnya, tapi karena ada semacam perjanjian kerjasama antara pemerintah Kota Batu dengan kita, Yayasan Munir, Museum Munir, itu terganjal gara-gara namanya tidak diberikan, namanya dibuat nama Museum Kota Batu, sementara kita nggak mau kalau tidak ada nama Munirnya. Jadi sedang mendiskusikan itu, ya semoga saja segera selesai dan segera kita launch museum yang baru. Itu.
For the progress of museum, Human Rights Munir Museum, it should have been. We were held by the government of Batu and province.
Area government.
And then by the provincial government, funds were also given, and today it should have been completed, but because there was some kind of cooperation agreement between the Batu City government and us, that the name Munir from the museum itself was about to be removed by the Batu government, and we didn't want that, so we didn't want it otherwise.
Kita namanya Museum Munir, tapi tiba-tiba tidak ada, kita nggak mau itu.
Yeah, from the start we wanted to be Munir Human Rights Museum instead of like just Human Rights Museum, because the brand was supposed to be Munir Human Rights Museum. Hopefully it's finished, and soon we will be having a new museum soon.
Right.
Right. This is a question directed directly to Matt and perhaps to Suciwati as well. But Matt, I'm impressed with the quantity of detail that you have about so many things about what was going on, the human rights violations, all the things that you were able to find out, as well as some of the wonderful things that we now know about Munir, Suciwati, the children. How did you do all that? How did you find out all this stuff? It's really impressive.
He had 10 years.
Yes. I mean, in some cases, the problem was not a lack of information. It was making sense of all the information and trying to figure out what a reader might want to know, especially one who might not be able to picture the scenes that I'm describing. But in other cases, there are gaps. There were people who did not want to talk to me yet, prosecutors who said, maybe one day, but not today, or people who had talked to me, but it was off the record. And I was helped enormously by the fact that the human rights community in Indonesia they went to every single session of every trial. They wrote down what the witnesses said, and then their own summary of what had happened and what the courtroom atmosphere was like. There was an incredible amount of work done on the Munir case within Indonesia. some of which I was there for, and some of which I wasn't. I was struck by. I thought I knew the case pretty well from having followed it in real time, and then there's also a whole variety of things that I didn't realize how they were related or what seemed to be going on behind the scenes. That only when I sort of put it all together was I able to have a greater sense of it. If that answers your question.
There's a question in back.
Do you think it's possible that American large corporations that underpay Indonesian citizens play a role in fueling the Indonesian government's tyrannical power?
Well, there's no question that the U.S. government and corporations played a large role before and after the fall of Suharto. World's largest copper and gold mine was established by Freeport-McMoran back starting in the 60s. Exxon and various other oil companies. Many of the Munir got his start, as did Suciwati, as labor activists in East Java, working with workers in foreign factories run by contractors, many of them out of South Korea or other countries. So all of these corporations have played a large role in two ways. One, I guess you could say, in propping up previous authoritarian regime, and also giving that government a particular stake in what it considered one of the pillars of its development program, which was stability. That these foreign investment would only come if they could maintain stability, and stability, sometimes came at the end of a gun. There's no question that there's a connection there. Things have in some senses changed dramatically, but there's still foreign investment will always play an important role, as will people trying to create the conditions to allow that to occur, including low wages and obstructions to unionizing.
Hi. I was wondering whether Suciwati or his family learned anything from having this book written. I don't know if they've read it, but what was that process like, and did you learn anything from that?
Were you able to hear that question? It was about what, if anything, did Suciwati and the family learn from the process of the book being written and reading the book?
Tentu saja saya sangat bangga dengan Matthew karena cukup lama memang membuat buku ini, dan tulisannya detail, dan dia sangat hati-hati, dan saya cukup gembira ketika menerima dan bisa membaca buku ini. Dan ada teman dari Amerika menuliskannya tentang keberanian Munir dan tidak menyerah untuk terus berjuang terhadap keadilan itu sendiri. Saya senang dan cukup bangga. Terima kasih, Matthew.
I'm very proud of Matthew because it took him a long time to make this book, and the writing was very detailed and he was very careful. We were very happy. There was an American friend who wanted to write about Munir's courage. I was very happy and very proud to Matthew Easton.
Dan yang menerbitkan juga.
And people who were.
We are grateful to Matthew. We are grateful to the publisher who publicly spread his writing about Munir to other people in other countries, to
thank you.
No. We are very grateful for all the aforementioned people and publishers to tell story about Munir. Grateful, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew.
Well, just in case I don't get another chance to say it, I'm incredibly grateful to Suciwati and to Alef and Diva for all the time they gave me, explaining things over and over again and taking me to locations that were meaningful to them. And I would not have tried to tell the story without their support and encouragement, and also their encouragement to tell the story as accurately and fully as I was able to do it. And I will say that Suciwati is a gifted writer as well, and one day, will tell the story in her own way, in her own book, and I look forward to that day very much.
And we have time for one more question from Zoom, which is from Sally. Why do you think military-connected and politically connected militias are allowed to continue to threaten activists and disrupt public human rights and discussions, whereas the government did move to ban the Islamic Defenders Front?
I will try to answer that generally rather than getting too far into the weeds beyond my knowledge of contemporary Indonesian politics. I will say that the general answer is they'll be allowed to continue because they're serving somebody's purposes and needs, and can be helpful in meeting out pressure on other parties in ways that that political figures can maintain some distance from. And as I'm sure the questioner knows, these paramilitaries have been part of the Indonesian political environment for a very long time, even if they've transformed somewhat in shape and in purpose, but they've a long history of really being part of that environment. And the Islamic Defenders Front has, in some ways, may share some of those features, but also, clearly perceived as enough of a threat to the government to be something that would be worthwhile banning.
Thank you to all three of you for this really meaningful and wonderful conversation. And thank you to our wonderful audience. Can we give another round of applause to everyone?